Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the May AHDB webinar. My name is Richard Meredith. I'm the AHDB Cereals and Oilseeds Knowledge Exchange Manager for the West of England and Wales. It's my great honour tonight to be chairing the webinar. I'm sat with our two speakers in sunny Suffolk, and we are looking forward to tonight's webinar and having some good discussion with you all. Just to run through the housekeeping as usual. You're all muted, we can't hear you. You can only see our slides, so don't panic about that. If you've got any questions, please feel free to ask them. There's a question box on the right-hand side of your screen. We encourage questions as we go through, time permitting, and there will be a Q&A session at the end, also time permitting. On that note, we're aiming to finish around 8:15 to 8:30, depending on how many questions we get through. The webinar will be recorded and put up onto the AHDB YouTube site within the next week. If you collect basis or Noroso points, please write your name, date of birth, and your basis or Noroso number and your postcode into the questions box. I've got the registers here, and you can collect your points and send them off for you afterwards. Okay, so on to tonight's webinar. Up on the screen here, we've got your two speakers, Rob Fox and John Pawsey. The photo was taken moments ago. Rob and I have had a fascinating tour around John's farm this afternoon, and we've been here for a few hours. And tonight's webinar, it's going to be hard to condense everything in. There's so much to talk about already. But very grateful for these two speakers giving up their time tonight, and we're going to be learning a bit more about organic farming. I'm going to hand over to Rob first. Rob, he's the strategic farmer from the west of England. Rob, just tell us a bit about yourself and your farm, and then we'll hand over to John.
Hi, yeah, thank you, Richard. So my name is Rob Fox. I am the AHDB Strategic Arable Farm for the West region at the moment, having already done 3 years as a monitor farmer. Myself, originally from a family dairy and arable farm in Warwickshire, just outside Shipson on Stour. Took the decision to move away from there, go to college, and I did an HND at Sealhane Agricultural College for a couple of years before returning home for a few years, and then moving on to work as an operator on a 2,500 acre joint venture arable business in Northamptonshire. From there, I moved on to where I am now at Hob Hall Farm, where I've now been for over 8 years, 9 years actually. As mentioned before, did 3 years as a monitor farmer, 2014, 2017. And then after a year off, I decided to jump back into it and volunteer for the strategic farm position, running from 2018 for the next 6 years. The farm I manage for the Evans family, just outside Leamington Spa. We're 1,000 acres of arable, and we're in a arable joint venture over about 18 or 1900 acres. We're on some very heavy clays, up to about 65% clay content, but quite varied out the back of Leamington and up through down the M40 down to Gaydon. We like to think our soils are in good condition. We run a sort of controlled traffic, managed traffic system to not overrun on the ground, but with it being heavy clays and some very steep banks in places, we have a high horsepower requirement. As mentioned, varied soils with very varied infield yields. Winter wheat ranging from 5.5 to 15.5, and oilseed rape ranging from about 1 tonne per hectare up to about 7.5. We like our technology. We're all auto steered, variable rate on most applications.
John, at this point, we'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much, Rob, and it's been great meeting you and touring around the farm this afternoon. So a little bit of background about Chimping Park Farms. We crop about 1,470 hectares. It's all organic crops, of which about 650 of those are my own. The rest are farmed under contract farming agreements. We've got around about 1,000 breeding ewes. And just as a sort of fun fact, we're on about half a horsepower per hectare, or 0.8 of a horsepower per hectare with a combine harvester put in there. And funnily enough, I worked out our gas oil use per hectare this morning for an NFU questionnaire, and we are 68 litres of not gas oil per hectare. No idea where that is, but that's what I worked out this morning. We got 3 full-time staff who have been fantastic, and I put them through a lot of changes over the years, and they've been incredibly supportive. And we have I put down here 1 full-time shepherd. Actually, we contract the shepherding to local shepherd Robert Spink, and he provides all the labour for the shepherd for us for the sheep for us throughout the year. We also do get in additional help during busy periods, but that's mainly along the lines of sort of non-specialist tasks. So hedge cutting we buy that, and not that hedge cutting is non-specialist, may I add. It's a very specialist job, and we're really grateful, but we do get an extra help. We have extra help in the office as well, and we have a neighbouring farmer who drives our combine harvester. So we partially converted the farm in 1999, and we are currently on our own farm running a 6-year rotation. And I've just listed some of the crops that we've grown over the last sort of 20 years. And I'm going to go into the rotation a bit later on.
Just before we move on there, John, some really interesting facts there. Looking at horsepower per hectare, that's a lot lower than where we would be. We would be at something like 1.25 per hectare. Obviously, you've got to take into account there some steep banks and heavier soils. But yeah, really interesting to see that you're managing to.
Well, I think really, Robert, you were saying your clay content was sort of over 60%, where ours is 35.
Yeah.
So yeah, that probably is reflected in that figure.
But very interesting that you're getting it down to half a horsepower per hectare, and the fact that you know that figure and you're very interested in that figure.
Yeah. So we, as I mentioned before, we partially converted some land in 1999, and to be honest, it was for us it was a diversification exercise. We were, struggling to make money at wheat at £79 a tonne. Rate was £117 a tonne. But the organic market at the time was really sort of gaining some traction, and it was in sort of double-digit figure growth year on year, and based pretty much down to the sort of list of things that you can see on the screen here, which was improved health awareness. It was just post BSC. People were worried about health scares. Also, a bit of negative campaigning has sort of started from various sort of NGOs, not my style, but there's no doubt that probably helped the market at the time to a certain extent. But also just people beginning just to talk about environmental and animal welfare concerns. But also importantly, there was governmental support, and there was, the government were quite happy to talk about organic farming, and there was the Organic Farmers Scheme, which started in 1999, and we were one of the first applicants onto that scheme, and the supermarkets were looking for lots of organic produce. So it was something very positive and something that I felt as a farmer that I was genuinely interested in. So again, it was a farm diversification as far as I was concerned. But when I started thinking about going into organics, and I think this is probably the same with sort of no-till, I don't know, but when you start talking about a different farming system, a lot of people tell you all the reasons why you can't do it. And I was really lucky because I had this guy just down the road from me, about 5 miles, called Ben Powell. And Ben had been farming organically for 20 years. And so when, people were saying I couldn't do it, I went and saw Ben, and his farm looked absolutely fantastic. And he gave me some figures, some expected yields, what I thought I would be able to sell out, so we could put some proper budgets together. So that was a huge, huge help. So we converted 54 hectares in 1999 and a further 65 in 2000. And we went through a 6-year rotation, which is a pretty bog standard organic recommendation at the time. So we went through those first 6 years, and then we compared our actual figures that we'd achieved from organic rotation with our mostly sort of conventional figures on the farm. And this is a rather dated looking spreadsheet, but this is the report that I prepared and looked at actually after that sort of first six years. And if you look down at the bottom line, we were around about £151 a hectare better off farming organically. At the time, we just started contract farming, so I then decided to convert the whole of our farm to organic. I went to our contract farmers and said, look, this is what we're thinking about doing. You know, feel free to go and get quotes from other contractors who can continue to do it conventionally. But I'm really pleased to say that they all came with us, which was, I think, was a big endorsement of what we'd been doing.
I'll just butt in there for a minute. Where
Sure.
are you managing to market your organic crop? Is that locally or further away, or how are you managing that?
Well, it's a really interesting question, because when we converted, the organic market was growing, and people were saying that we will buy anything that you can grow. But actually, when I finished my conversion, it was more difficult than I thought. Presently, we market our grains through 3 different outlets. One through CamGrain, another outlet is through Organic Arable, and another one is through Saxon Agriculture. Organic Arable is the organisation that really actually joins the sort of a food chain together, in that Organic Arable really focuses on dealing with end customers. So through them, we have sold our combinable crops to BQP, British Quality Pigs, which have all their feed milled at Burston, which is a short haul for us. But also we've been growing spelt for Sharpen Park and oats for White's Oats in Northern Ireland. I've also grown some quinoa for Stephen Jones, the British quinoa company. So marketing, you've really got to focus pretty hard on that.
And is any of it open marketing, or is it all with an arrangement in place?
Certainly through Organic Arable, it's with an arrangement, but with others, it's generally you're signing over certain tonnages to people to go out there and market it on the organic spot market. So this is our rotation, and surprisingly, it looks relatively similar to the one that we started with, but there's little tweaks in there. Certainly when we first started farming organically, we really just put down 100% red clover lays instead of having diverse lays, because we wanted to make it as simple as possible. But since then, we've gone to putting in clover mixtures. So we have 50% red clover, and the rest is split between relatively evenly between Persian crimson, bird's foot trefoil, sainfoin, and sometimes there's a little bit of grass in there. But we also put in some chicory and some ribgrass for sort of deeper rooting, but a mixture to have lots of different rooting depths and different ways of conditioning the soil. And in our sheep lays, we have also diverse clover mixtures and various herbs in there as well, because the sheep graze the grass very tight, and I want some more root action going on in the soil, as they do tend to graze some of our lays quite tightly. And then in year 3, that's really our banker. This is where we're at sort of the highest point of our fertility, and that can be winter spelt or wheat, winter wheat, or if we want to extend the fertility building a little bit longer, we can put in we've been growing some spring quinoa. Then year 4, we're switching from a winter crop into a spring crop, and generally that's spring oats or barley, but really depending on the market. Year 5, we need to put a bit of nitrogen back into the system, so we're trying to go through a legume at that point. And generally, we've been growing quite a bit of winter beans. I'll talk a little bit about spring beans later on and why we don't really favour them. But spring peas as well, we've grown in the mix as well, and we've grown them intercropped with spring barley. But we're going to talk a little bit about intercropping a bit later on. And then the final year is spring barley, which is undersown again, and you go right back to the regenerative phase of your rotation, which is the 2-year lay. And I've just put at the bottom here, just be prepared to change, because every field has to be treated differently. And we're going to talk a little bit about crop architecture later on, which is an important thing to consider when you're looking on fields on an individual basis.
So to bring that back to what we're doing on our conventional system, we're on a 5-year system, usually growing winter wheat, winter rape, winter wheat, and then a double spring bake of usually spring barley and spring beans. Now we've sort of had to go down that route of more spring cropping because of weed burden, in particular blackgrass in our area, and now roughly a third of our area at any one time may be in spring crops. And looking at yours there, John, years 3, 4, and 5 and 6, you're moving between a winter and a spring and a winter and a spring. Is that mainly because of weed issues to help you control, or are there other reasons there?
It's about weed issues, but it's actually about just bringing as much diversity into the system as possible. So it's about, and we're going to talk about it a bit later on, hopefully, about pests. It's about breaking life cycles. So it's more than just weeds. It's everything. It's about weeds, pests, and diseases.
Yeah.
I've got a very quick question about previous slide, John. Just someone asking, what was the other income for organic farming?
So the other income there, so if you look at that slide, it was an average across the whole 6 years. So there's some sort of spurious looking figures, but that would be the organic farm scheme payments, and also a little bit of, because we were paid for growing pulses in those days as well.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to move on to cultivations. Now, I know ploughing is terribly out of fashion, and it's not terribly good for our soils, but as far as we're concerned here, and looking at our soil health, which we're also going to talk a little bit about later on, is that we do fit ploughing into our rotation. It's a useful tool, particularly in front of winter beans, where we really want to be sowing the beans later on. So we need to dry our soils out so we can get on and drill them in late October, early November. But over the last few years, we've really been trying to stop ploughing. Before we converted to organic, we did very, very little ploughing. And we've gone back to using our Gregoire, Besson, and Discodon. The great thing about something like that is that we're able to break a lay with it. And you can see the larger picture here, and the picture of 3 is a field that we've got some winter oats in this year, and that was just after a 2-year lay. And you can see the rows of oats coming up in between the turves, but the turves have all been killed, and it means that we've disturbed the soil less than if we would have ploughed. But generally, the 2 forms of primary cultivation we have are either with the Gregoire Besson or the Discodon, or it's with a Horsch Turano, and then of course a plough before winter beans possibly. We've really given up ploughing before spring crops because I feel that our land is too tender after the winter if you plough it and then you're going to plant spring crops. We need more structure in the soil before spring crops. The other cultivators we have a Valiseg carrier, which we used to use after ploughing just to take the top of the plough, but also really sort of to chop up turfs, as you can see in that picture, and deal with weeds. And the other last primary cultivator we have, or secondary cultivator, sorry, is a springtime cultivator. And really, when you're considering cultivations and you're thinking about weeds, I mean, you need to be careful about the cultivation type that you use. So for instance, with creeping thistle or docks or couch grass, you don't want to be using discs. And so a tine is important. So, I think you've just got to be thinking about every field individually to know what type of cultivation you're going to need to deal with the specific problems you might or might not have. But it's just sort of busting the myth that there's not necessarily, you don't have to do a lot of ploughing if you're farming organically.
So John, we're looking at some winter oats there, I think. And yep. What are you looking for when you're deciding on varieties? We're still looking for high yielding group 4 wheats on my farm, and it may well be, and certainly up until recently, they are slightly dirtier varieties, but we're still finding that controlling that as we do, the higher yielding varieties are still better for us. What are you looking at when you're looking for your variety choice?
First of all, we're looking at winter wheat. We start looking at the AHDB recommended list, and we sort of apply this sort of kind of scoring system. So as far as quality is concerned, we do struggle to get a decent milling quality because it's all about fertility. So in the sort of first wheat slot, that's where we're probably going to get a greater chance of getting protein. We only have to achieve 11% protein to get a milling sample rather than your 13. But aside quality, we're looking at the sort of untreated yield, and we're really looking at something for 85 plus. It's not a true untreated yield, of course, because it's only a yield without fungicides. So even though we look at it, we don't really put a huge amount of credence to it. And then we look down at the different sort of weed resistance, and we have a scoring system, which we then just sort of add really crudely add up at the bottom and pick out the most disease resistant varieties that are available. And actually what's interesting, I did this exercise the other day, is that KWS seem to be coming up with quite a lot of disease resistant varieties, which is really encouraging. But it's very difficult because we actually find that modern wheat varieties are the most difficult ones we have to work with. They really do break down to disease quicker than, say, possibly oats. And spring barley is one of our most consistently yielding crops. But also we then have to, we also look at other crops in the rotation to get over the fact that we don't want to have a huge amount of winter wheat if we're worried about disease, as in modern varieties. So the other thing that we've been looking at is, we've been doing is putting in varietal blends. So we'll very often mix varieties on farm, and especially with winter wheats. So we're growing a mix of modern varieties this year as our varietal blend, and they're milling wheats. We've also looked in the past at growing populations, and there's the Wakelands population, which I don't know if anyone's heard of, but it's basically 20 different varieties, with every one variety being crossed with every 20 variety. And the whole the theory behind it is that in a field, no one plant stands next to its genetic neighbor. And so it's really taking varietal blends to the sort of nth degree. And the idea is for the crop to, it's about preventing any disease sort of, raging through a crop. So if you've got no plant standing next to its genetic neighbor, the idea is that it's less likely that the disease will be able to rage through a crop. But also looking at crop mixtures, and we're going to talk about that a bit later on about, growing crops with other crops. Then there's a problem of separation. But if you're looking at spreading risk for disease, but also weeds, growing crop mixtures is something that we should be looking at. But it sort of makes me think about, what are we wanting from our varieties in the future. And this is why it's interesting doing this with AHDB, because maybe we need to be looking at a sort of a different scoring system and encouraging our plant breeders to look at what we want in a different way, especially with people sort of focusing on sort of regenerative agriculture, looking at a sort of more biological way of farming rather than a chemical way of farming. So, I'm talking about, looking at crop architecture. And today we went out and we saw some spring barley that had a sort of a very sort of erect sort of nature to its growth. So the rows between the barley take a lot longer to close up, and so you're leaving your soils exposed for weeds to be germinating more in a crop of barley than we saw a crop of oats, where it had these long leaves sort of spreading over the rows, which shade weeds quicker. But also looking at varieties that having better nutrient scavenging abilities, and by bringing in a scoring system that looks at that, hopefully will encourage plant breeders to respond to that need. And the other 2 points about the ground cover rate and varietal vigor are really looking at how quickly crops can sort of spread across the ground. So increased tillering, just getting off to a better start, and that's all important when you're looking at smothering weeds in an arable rotation.
John, I'm going to stop you there for a couple of quick questions while we're on our way. First one is, while no-till isn't the ultimate nirvana, do you see a time when organic no-till will be possible, and if so, how?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I've spent a lot of time thinking about that. I've spent a bit of time visiting farmers who are attempting it, and the crimper roller, and we're going to look at something a bit later on, but the crimper roller, having to roll your cover crops at anthesis with the crimper roller, I think is incredibly challenging to then be able to get a cash crop in afterwards, because what species are we looking at? What is going to reach anthesis at the end of September? What species are going to reach anthesis at the end of March? So I think there are real challenges there. So we have done a trial here. I've given up on it. We just got sort of overtaken with creeping thistle, docks, that kind of thing. So I think it's a real challenge, massive challenge.
One other quick question was, and it might be who to come back to, do you have an idea of what sort of gross margins you are getting on the 2 years of herbal lays?
The kind of gross margins we're getting on the 2 years of herbal lays. Well, we're going to do gross margin later on. Yeah. So yeah, I can tell you that. Yeah. I'm going to sorry.
Just before we move on from that slide, going back a bit, I think this is an area, the last two things on that slide is an area where I think organic is going to overlap with a conventional farm, in that we are also looking for varieties of high biomass, are leafy enough to try and smother out the blackgrass issues and the other issues that we've got with weeds. So yeah, I think having an addition in there on the recommended list, or some way of monitoring or rating varieties by vigor or biomass, late biomass, I think would be really important going.
And actually, I've also forgotten to say, this is a picture of we grow a heritage wheat blend, and it's a very small crop, just a very small market, but I think it really demonstrates the ability of this heritage wheat blend, which is sort of varieties, sort of older varieties, pre-dwarfing, compared to some siskin, which is on the right-hand side of the picture. So although the heritage blend is leaning, it didn't go flat. We still combined it perfectly easily. You can see that it's smothering weeds. You can see a splattering of weeds in the siskin. But the most amazing thing about the heritage wheat block was that this was a field of milling wheat. So we put in for a trial for a baker in Oxford. And the dark blue lines are the higher protein levels. So the block of dark blue is the heritage wheat blend, which averaged at the end of the day 16% protein, compared to all the other modern milling varieties that averaged 11. So somewhere along the line, we managed to breed out a hell of a lot of protein out of our wheat. But it should be qualified by the fact that the modern wheat varieties yielded better than the heritage wheat varieties. But if you're paid for quality, then hopefully there should be some leveling as far as gross margins are concerned. So the next thing we were just going to go on to is the sort of areas of pest diseases and weeds and how do we deal with them. And when I first put these slides together, I suddenly realized I'm just giving a talk in integrated pest management. And so it's the same for everyone. So we can probably, race through these a little bit because they're things that I'm sure that everybody has considered and is doing. But I think, diversity in cropping, and we sort of touched on it before about, looking at, just spreading risk and growing as many different crops as possible. But that means going out and getting the markets for it. But then diversity within cropping. So, trying to get different cultivars within crops to disrupt life cycles. But also increasing, of course, we haven't sprayed insecticides for 20 years. And so we've built up a huge amount of insects, not all beneficial, some things that aren't beneficial. But my feeling is that, if you have got the stock there, when you have an explosion of something, you've got the stock there to have an equal and opposite effect. And this picture was taken from the back of our mower when we were mowing some of our clover lays, and it was just absolutely teeming with everything, quite frightening. It looked like something from a horror film, to be quite honest. But there are some problems we've got that we haven't got over, and one is gout fly and spring wheat. And so we really struggle to grow a reliable yielding spring wheat because of gout fly. It was a great shame because it's one of the ways that we can get into the milling wheat market. And the other thing, I think spring beans, I mentioned before, spring beans are very difficult because they get black fly when they are on flower, whereas the winter beans get it a bit at the same time, but of course the crop's much more advanced, so maybe it just affects the top of the crop.
I think as a conventional farmer, again, I think we're learning a lot of lessons from the organic sector here, because as we lose actives to control insects, we need to be looking at other ways of managing the issues and trying not to create the problems in the first place. So I think this is certainly an area where I can learn from the organic sector.
So then on to diseases. Again, these are all things as far as disease is concerned that we're all looking at. I suppose the thing that we're probably looking at more than conventional farmers is probably crop spacing. And crop spacing, because going on to the next slide in a second, we're going to be talking about weeds, and we want to inter-row hoe in between our crops. But certainly leaving wider spacing in between certain combinable crops certainly would help with limiting the spread of disease. This is a picture of some winter oats, and the slot here was ready for winter beans. But one of the big problems we have, one of the big disease problems, is chocolate spot in winter beans. So we were trying to see how we sort of deal with that sort of risk. And so the idea was to, and what we did is we planted the winter oats on the middle of September, and then in the middle of October we inter-row sowed with our drill the winter beans. So still sowing them later to minimise the risk of chocolate spot. So the idea was twofold. So either the oats would disrupt chocolate spot from spreading within the bean crop, but even if the bean crop did get bad chocolate spot, then the cultivated oats would dominate, and yet would still get a yield. And actually it didn't really go to plan. Actually there wasn't a chocolate spot year, so the beans didn't get bad chocolate spot, but the oats really did dominate. But we got the highest yield of organic winter oats that we'd ever had. So there's something going on there between the beans and the oats. The difficulty is then separating those crops after harvest. But I thoroughly recommend you read Andy Howard's Nuffield Scholarship on intercropping. It's a great read, and I think we should all be looking at this much more intently. So disease issues, I've talked a little bit about that. Chocolate spot is the main one in beans. The other one that really has been a killer in the past has been yellow rust in winter wheat. But as you saw from the AHDB recommended lists, those breeders really have focused on yellow rust, so we don't have to put up with another harvest 2012.
The oats and the beans, John, are you looking to take that forward onto a larger acreage, or is this a one-off trial, or is this something you're doing now? Or
no, we're trying different things. So we've done oats and beans, we've done peas and barley, and we've done oats and buckwheat. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to do it on a trial basis, just to work out, the financials, because of course, if we're going to be investing in some kind of separation machinery at harvest time, we've got to actually know what added value we're getting from these this sort of bi-cropping or companion cropping. So we're not there yet, but it's a work in progress. And finally, it's weeds, and this is a long list of things that really you need to be on top of for dealing with weeds. But I'd say the list is applicable to the other diseases and pests as well. And somebody once said to me, what is your major form? What's your primary form of weed control in an organic system? And I just said, there isn't one. You've got to be doing absolutely everything. You've got to be doing this whole list. You've got to be considering all these things. So every single field's got to be treated on an individual basis. I'm not sure if we want to go into any of these things in great detail, other than stress the fact that looking at the way that different combinable crops grow and their ability to smother weeds by the nature of their leaves, the height of them, the way that they tiller is incredibly important. And having farmed without herbicides for 20 years, I really do understand that, and I do think that it's a thing that our plant breeders really should be focusing on. Well, I'm not going to talk about livestock today, but we did reintroduce livestock, which I think is an important part of our rotation for fertility, but as well as dealing with weeds, but also just closing that sort of nutrient cycle on the farm. Problem weeds, funnily enough, when we were first converted, I was still thinking very much like a conventional farmer, so doing lots of winter cropping. Blackgrass was a problem, but I think now our weed profile has changed. Blackgrass is not such a problem, but in certain fields we have bad charlock, which we're dealing with interrow hoeing and weed surfing. Poppies, poppies, in the old days, IPU did a very good job on poppies. And I think we've been sort of lulled into a false sense of security, but poppies can rob a huge amount of yield. And we do have one or two fields that have problem poppies. And wild oats, winter wild oats, they can grow like a forest. And if you think blackgrass suppresses yields, you want to see what winter wild oats can do. They get out of control. So you've got to be doing everything. That's the key.
John, a couple of questions here. Your oats and beans, back to them. How do you get around that they're ripening or being harvested at different times?
That's a really interesting question. What happens when you start bi-cropping or you start growing different crops together? There's a lot of competition to survive and to flower and to get through their life cycle. So actually what happens physically in the field is that they actually come to harvest pretty much at the same time. Mm-hmm. That's not always the case, but the other thing I would say is that if your oats are very dry at harvest time, there's a little bit of green in there, put them in the grain store, turn the fans on for a couple of days, and it all evens out. I don't think it's a massive problem or something that you should worry about.
Yeah. Also, are you chopping or selling your straw? We
chop and put everything back into the ground. The only thing that we export off this farm are seeds, meat, and wool. It's really tempting to sell the straw because a organic mushroom grower will pay us handsomely for it, but just not interested in exporting anything else than seed, meat, and wool.
Just before we move on from that slide, John, it was really interesting when we were out and about this afternoon and going back to the weeds that you consider to be an issue. I came here today thinking that you were going to be doing everything you could to control or weed out your black grass, because that's one of my biggest issues. But actually, a lot of the weeds that I can control quite easily are a huge problem for you. And it was really eye-opening to notice that actually what I thought might be the problems in an organic system aren't.
Yeah, actually, I remember when we first converted, I thought my major weed problems were going to be blackgrass and cleavers, because I just remember sitting on a combine, trying to pull huge amounts of cleavers out of the reel, but actually cleavers need a huge amount of fertility, and they don't get that in an organic system, so they sit in the bottom of the crop.
Christy Willett over at Chelmsford Monitor Farm in Essex got a question about colour sorting machines.
Yes.
They're being used for improving crop separation. Have you tried or thought about that?
Yeah, I have, and I think if we, well, ideally, that would be part of a sorting system that we would invest in if I feel confident that there's going to be an adequate payback on investing that kind of machinery. But yes, colour sorter, absolutely, yeah. And so anyway, if everything else fails, of course, we've got mechanical weeding. So we imported the first one of these machines in 2015, and it was a Swedish farmer called Joel Masson, who's we were talking earlier on about saying, where are the best organic farmers, and I think they're in Scandinavia. They're really, doing incredible things over there. And this system, Chameleon, was devised by a man called Lars Askling, who runs a company called Gothia Redskap. We had been using a tined interrow hoe beforehand, and the difficulty we found with tines on our soil type, and this is specifically talking about our soil type, is that on a tine system, if the tine gets resistance, it can move in several ways, and as it's moving, it's changing the hoeing profile of that hoe. But this Chameleon works on a parallelogram system. So if you look at the picture, you can see these coulters on the front. So they are, sorry, it's easier. If you can see one of the coulters at the back of the machine, and you can see that it's just got a drilling coulter on it. So there's no hoe blades on the side. So that's the drilling system. Then when you want to go hoeing, you put on this hoe blade, which you can see on the front of the machine, which is held on by a single roll pin. So you drill with this machine, then it's got a camera on it and a hydraulic system that when you drill the crop, it then switches the machine over into the middle of the row, and then you can go hoeing with it. And the crucial thing is, well, two things. One, the same machine hoes the crop that drilled it, which is, in my mind, very important because the accuracy is much greater. But the parallelogram design means that the hoe is independently mounted on its own wheel and is at exactly the right depth. So it doesn't matter what your field is doing, it's always hoeing or sowing at exactly the right depth. And the other great thing about it, because it's a drill and we're doing a lot of undersowing and putting in sort of, I talked a little bit about, interrow sowing the winter beans into our winter oat crop. Because when you switch over and you go hoeing, you can also be seeding at the same time. So very often, and in fact more often than not, we are always seeding something when we go through with our last hoe, because it's either building fertility or using another crop to smother weeds and smother weeds really. And so when you start thinking of all the permutations, what you can do with this machine, it's a very long list. So this picture shows it drilling in the top picture, a little bit of a cloddy seabed, I hate to admit to, but then you can see it in doing some hoeing. I'm hopefully going to be able to show you a little clip of it hoeing in a second, but you can see that there's two different coulters. You can get either just a pure seeding one for sort of cash crop, but you can also get another coulter, and you can see some outlets on the side there that you can be sowing two crops at once if you so choose. So the permutations of this machine are endless, and I'm going to show you a quick. So before I show you one, this is a picture of sort of post hoeing. And it shows you two things. One, it's absolutely terrifying because you think, oh my God, you know, the crop's covered in soil. Is it ever going to sort of pick up again? Yes, it does. You've just got to not go look at it for a week. The other thing is this picture shows is that you've got this world tiller blackgrass plant that is just ripped out of the soil. And I think that I showed Rob some fields today that we'd hoed and some that we haven't hoed. And I think you'll agree that, you know, it did take pretty much out everything in the
Absolutely,
row,
yeah, it did a very good job from what I could see.
Yeah. So very briefly, there's this clip I'm just going to play. Hopefully, it's going to play. So this is it hoeing. Oh, it's going very fast. But it slows down here. Hopefully, it's a bit jolty, I think, because the internet connections are maybe a bit slow. But anyway, now you can see it sort of slow down, and you can see how aggressive it's hoeing. It's got the camera on the side there. You can see sort of on the side of the machine. It's also got following harrows that run along the side of the crop, right up the side of the crop to hoe out bits that the hose won't do.
And that machine's 9 meters wide, is it?
Yeah, it's actually, they sell an 8 meter wide one, and but they sell a kit to extend it to 9 meters. So ours is 9 meter wide. Yeah, I should have said actually we're on 9 meters. 9 meter controlled traffic farming, and we're very strict to our controlled traffic farm. We're either cultivating at 8.8 meters or 4.4, and the combine harvester drops the grain into the next door tramline.
What kind of acreage a day can it cover?
So it drills at about 4.2 hectares an hour and hoes at 4.5 hectares an hour. So how long do you want to work for? You can go till midnight. So looking at the sort of opportunities, you know, there's definitely increased weeding accuracy as far as we're concerned on our soil, and I think that gives us opportunities to grow different crops that we haven't been able to grow before because they're not competitive with weeds. And this is a picture of it hoeing in Sweden in some organic linseed. The Swedes are also, because it places the undersown small seeds very accurately underneath the soil and on moisture, the Swedes are dropping their small seed rates by 2/3. So we'll be drilling red clover at 12.5 kilograms a hectare, and I've met Swedish farmers who are growing red clover at 5 kilograms a hectare. So there's potential to save quite a lot of money on seed costs. Also, we do have the direct ability to drill crops in cleaner fields. I'm going to show you a slide on that in a bit. Again, the ability to intercrop or relay crop. But also the other thing that we found, because we are often, when we're putting in green manures, we're obviously sometimes looking at a lower fertility situation, and it enables us to put our green manures in before harvest. So when harvest comes along, we harvest the crop and they're already established, and, you know, given a bit of sunshine and rain, they just get off to a much better start.
I think, again, John, this is an area where your system could overlap into a conventional system. Should conventional farmers like myself, do you think there's an opportunity for us to be hoeing or weeding either in the crop or using other machinery pre-drilling to try and wipe out a flush of weeds? Do you think that's feasible?
I do. I mean, I think that, you know, to my mind, I mean, although this machine has been developed for the organic market, there's a lot of them sold outside the organic market as well, not in the UK yet. But my feeling is that, you know, if you got it's a drill, and so, you know, we're now drilling on 321 millimeter rows and sowing in 120 millimeter bands of crop. Now that's a pretty common practice with especially people who are looking at conservation agriculture. Now, you know, if you've then got the ability, even though you still have the use of chemicals, to then go in and hoe out resistant weeds, I just don't see why you wouldn't do that. And given the other things about establishing, you know, undersown layers and green manure crops, I think it does offer real opportunities to conventional farmers. And just very briefly, they've just developed this for direct drilling into green cover crops. So they're really looking at establishing crops so keeping the ground green at all times, looking at a system of establishing crops into a growing green plant. So some low growing white clover or something like bird's foot trefoil. And I'm not sure how this is going to play, but they launched this thing. So this is really a toolbar that goes on the front of the chameleon. And if you can just see in this picture, there's a shouldered disc on the front, which creates a slot. And then you've got the coulters behind, and you can see they're running without any of the residue building up on the coulters, drilling the crop afterwards. So I think that that's not on the market yet, but it's something they're developing. So,
sorry, just
yes.
before we move on, what other machinery are you using on the farm?
Okay, so
for either hoeing or weeding, or
well, we use the Harrowcone weeder, and the Harrowcone weeder, to be honest, doesn't do a huge amount. It does mineralize a bit of nitrogen when you go through it in a standard crop, as does the chameleon, and we sort of had a look at that on the farm today. But it is something that I know the Swedes use a lot for blind weeding, which is so planting your crop, putting a cloche on the ground after you've drilled it, so forcing some weeds. As soon as you see some weeds underneath the cloche, you then go out there and you blind weed. So you drag your Harrowcone weeder across the field when you can't see anything at all. But actually what it's trying to do is get those weeds at that sort of little white root stage. And the Swedes consider it to be one of their biggest forms of weed control. The other thing we use is the CTM weed surfer, which was really developed for sugar beet bolters, weedy beet. We find it to be really, really successful on winter wild oats and charlock, and it's certainly reducing those numbers on our farm. On to soil health. Sorry, we're going to go back one because that's not. This is just an example of my my NRM project, and I've pulled out some of those figures, which I'm going to go on to. But Rob, were you going to just talk a little bit about yours as well?
Yeah. So next slide on, we thought we'd put up some similar results from a field in our conventional system, just so that people can have a look at sort of where we're sat at the moment. Obviously very different soil types. This was some lias clay, so some quite difficult ground when it wants to be, and like I said at the beginning, I think that my heavier soils are in pretty good nick. We've got no livestock. We are baling straw. We're baling all the cereal straw. We do incorporate the oilseed rape and the bean straw. But I just thought it'd be very interesting for people to have a look at that. There's always a difference of opinion on these reports and the information you get back from them. But I just thought it'd be good to compare the similar reports from the same lab, so you can see our organic matter, 7.7% on this one field, is quite respectable, I think. Most NPK there is either good or high, potentially causing issues elsewhere for lockup, perhaps. But then the final 5.4 soil health index, fractionally below yours, I think, John.
Yeah, but yours look pretty good, I have to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but like I say, very different soil type, very different clay content, but just thought it'd be an interesting comparison.
Definitely, that's really interesting. So I go into mine a little bit more here. I mean, this is looking. We test 4 fields every other year, and we do the NRM soil health test. And I know that the organic matter loss and ignition test is not great, but it's what we've been doing for a long period of time, so we can compare it. And so what this is showing is that Lodge Meadow is a bit of permanent pasture. So this has been a permanent pasture for forever, I think. And so we're sort of looking at that and seeing how we compare in our sort of tilled lands. And so how I've ordered these is in the first one, Drayton's, was in the first year of a 2-year lay. So if you look at the organic matter, it's 4.9%, so it's just come out of its exploitative part of the rotation, which is the 4 years of cropping. And then you look at the bush field, that was in its second year of the 2-year lay, so it showed a organic matter of 5.8%. And then as it goes through to later on the rotation, it's beginning to reduce. I mean, it's not sort of great dramatic figures, but it tells a bit of a story. But I think actually the soil health index at the bottom tells more of a story, which is, Drayton's, having had a lot of, crops growing up for 4 years, 3.9, then building up after the regenerative bit of the rotation to 5, and then back down to 3.1 as you go into the beans at the end of the rotation. It's sort of repeated in the similar report 2 years later, and it really shows the effect of what a rotation has. And I think that that's a really important message, is that I'm going to say true rotations, probably someone's going to shoot me down in flames, but true rotations, I believe, do have a real regenerative phase and should have. And that's about building fertility. It's about giving the ground a break. And now, we've brought in sheep to give us a bit of an income at that stage. But by doing that, it then allows you, without feeling of guilt or horror, to have an exploitative part of your rotation. And it's just how you design that, whether or not it's sustainable or not. And I feel that we're in a good place in that our soil organic matter is going up. And I feel that our soil health index is respectable, considering how we're managing our rotation. Just very briefly, looking at sort of phosphate fluctuations. So, we've got phosphate up there with a 3 and 2 zeros, and it just goes all over the place. I've sort of given up worrying about it, to be quite honest, because the first field that we converted 20 years ago are showing they can be a 0, they can be a 3, they can be a 2, depending on the year. And so I'm just not worrying about it. pH rising, we used to be all 7s, we're now all 8s. Phosphate solutions, we are sort of opportunistic in the way that we bring in anything that really we can get hold of to try and replace nutrients. And at the moment, we're bringing in a product from British Sugar, but if we can get hold of any local muck, we do that as well. And of course, we've got sheep back in our rotation.
Someone says, well, there's a couple of questions here about organic manures and organic matter being brought onto farm. One person's asked, have you looked at organically approved digestate?
Yes, well, the British Sugar product is organically approved digestate. Yeah.
A separate point, are you doing tissue sampling, and what foliar feeds are you allowed to use as an organic farmer?
We are allowed to use micronutrients, and we actually we do leaf tests, and we did a lot of leaf tests in that milling wheat trial that we did. We're working with Omex at the moment, and we're doing sap analysis, and we are putting on micronutrients. I have to say that I haven't found anything that sort of pays back the cost that we put into it. And as we were talking about earlier on, one of the revelations or the reliefs of farming organically was about sort of 4 years in, suddenly realizing that, I was off that input treadmill, which, I can't explain. It was just such a relief to be off it. I'm sort of slightly worried about something working really well. I've got to start getting back on it again. But having said that, I like to think that I'm doing new things, I'm trying new things. So if there's anything out there that's going to improve what we're doing and lessen the risk, as we're all trying to do with our rotations, then I'm going to try it.
Can you use biostimulants?
I've never used them. I'm pretty sure we can use them, and it's something that we should be looking at. Yeah. So lastly, on soil, we also spend a huge amount of time making sure that our ditches are dug. We mold drain our fields. We've got land drains in all our fields. And when you're looking at your cost of production, we spend between 10 and 15,000 pounds every year on digging ditches and making sure that our drains are in good condition and they're all working. So finally, we come on to gross margins and looking at sort of comparison between organic and non-organic gross margins. Now, sorry, before I just want to point out this is a crop of spelt, and we're talking about crop architecture earlier on. And if you look at this spelt, look at those huge, great big long ears. So as it's beginning to senesce, and this crop is just sort of going sort of olive green as it's going towards senescence. It's got these great big long ears that even when all the leaves have died back, the ears are still shading the grounds, preventing weeds from coming. Anyway, onto the figures. So the only way I felt that was fair to do this was to take figures from a book, the Agricultural Budgeting and Costing book, which is one of the only books that has gross margins for conventional and organic. And because we can all argue about these figures, and so it's the only fair comparison. So going on to, what I did for picking a non-organic rotation is something that's, I would argue sort of practiced relatively widely around where we are. So it's something that I would compare myself with. But also I went through the book and I picked out the three best gross margins that I could that also still related to some kind of a rotation. So if you look down these figures, now you can all argue about the yields and the prices, but I also can argue about the yields and prices and all the organic ones that I'm going to go on to. So let's not fight about it. Let's just say that this is the fairest way of doing it. And now I've obviously given you your £30 a hectare for environmental payments. And what I've done right at the bottom, the average gross margin in the bottom right-hand corner is your average gross margin of £741 a hectare. So if you look now at this is the rotation that we practiced for a long period of time before we had sheep, and it's the one that we still do practice on our contract farms. Now, again, I can argue about these prices and about the yields, but the other thing that we do have got in there is the environmental payments. So that is the countryside stewardship payments for 2 years of a conversion at £175 a hectare, and then the 3 following years of £60 a hectare. Now, you can say, well, that's really unfair, but at the end of the day, if you converted your farm tomorrow, this is what you'd get. So that's just a fact. And I would also say that if you, on average, it's about £100 a hectare. If you then take into account that you got £30 a hectare, you can only reduce my average gross margin by 70 quid. So if you looked back at the non-organic rotation, we're still doing better. So then if you then put some sheep in that, and I'm very happy with the way that our sheep have performed, that I'm very happy with these figures for sheep. The only one thing that I have changed, and you can shoot me down for this, but the only one thing I have changed, which is away from the book, is that after 2-year lays, I'm just not going to put up with organic milling wheat yielding at 4.7 tonnes a hectare. I'm going to put in 5. So, okay, you can take a picture of that and then work it out for yourselves, but it's not going to make a massive amount of difference. But it does make a difference to the gross margin at the bottom. So personally, I feel that there's a clear financial case for converting. And you don't have to convert everything like we did. We converted a part of the farm and just do it as a diversification exercise. And if you are looking at replacing your basic farm payment, this is how you do it. And there's other opportunities. So the 3 buildings that we used for storing fertilizer are now available for rent for commercial lets. So that's an extra income we didn't have before organic farming. Also, because our yields are around about half that in some crops, not quite half that in other crops, of storage, then we now rent out our grain store to other organic farmers for storing their grains. Increased likelihood and acceptance into environmental schemes. Well, the only reason why we got into HLS, because it was targeted, is because we were converting a large arable unit and bringing livestock back onto the farm. So that's why we got onto it. But I suppose one could argue that if we're looking at public goods, does organic farming have more to offer as far as public goods are concerned? Are you going to be more likely to get onto new schemes if you are looking at organic practice? I don't know, but I'm just putting that one out there. Since we've converted, we've just attracted a huge amount of people to the farm. We do 25 school visits a year, but we do lots of interested group farm walks, and that's from farmers, but also local villages. We've even had 12 vicars. So I've just got to work out, what I'm going to sell to these people. But what I'm saying is that we literally have thousands of people on the farm every year, and I've just got to work out what I'm going to sell them. Cash flow, very different profile to conventional farming, and certainly some of our contract farmers have found that an appealing thing. I would also argue that our operating capital is lower than conventional farmers. And as I said before, you don't have to do the whole farm. You can just do a partial conversion. There's a cleaning down procedures you have to do with your drill. You have to physically separate crops in the grain store, but it's not too onerous. And so I would suggest that partial conversion is the way forward for some people. And why wouldn't you want to do it, given the figures? So we're sort of getting on to my last slide, unless we've got anything else. I mean, just really sort of some take-home messages, I suppose. But based on the figures got out of that book at this time, these are the kind of increased margins you might expect, and I would argue you should expect on a farm with a soil type that holds its nutrients reasonably well. And again, if you're thinking about replacing your £220 a hectare of your basic payment, this is one of the ways you could do it. There's a huge demand for organic combinable crops. We still import 70% of organic feed crops into this country, so there's a big demand for that. And also increasingly, supermarkets are looking for more organic products, and the organic market is back into growth and is now higher than it was before the crash in 2008. But also the organic market is relatively small in this country. We're talking about exports. I mean, the EU market and the US market especially is booming, and I think we've got something to sell them. And whether you like organic farming or not, or the organic movement or not, and it's the only, arguably the only alternative market that offers farmers a genuine price premium. And I think that's something to shout about. And lastly, I put Brexit down here. Everything we sell at the moment goes to buyers in the UK, and I think that that helps us shield us from issues with Brexit. Also, inputs. We're not buying any inputs, and I think that also has a shielding factor. And I'm sure there's many others that you can think of. I'm sort of done.
Well, I've got a raft of questions for you. Before we turn to the Q&A session, if you've got any questions, please write them in now, and we'll try and get through them, because I've got a few coming in here. But we've got a bit of time left, so I'm happy to do that. I was going to ask Rob, what are your take-home messages from meeting John today and the webinar tonight? What's your...
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's been an absolutely fascinating afternoon here, so thank you very much, John. Really interesting business you've got going on. Looking to the future, I think there's huge lessons to be learned in the conventional sector from the organic sort of side of things. I'm really interested to see where we can go with in-crop hoeing in a conventional system. And I'm also very interested to see on how we build our organic matter. We import sewage sludge and a few other little things here and there, but we've got no livestock on the farm, so we haven't got that manure going back in, and you know, who knows, maybe we should be looking at a 1-year break from a commercial crop and just having a crop in to build the organic matter. So I think there's some really interesting messages. We're losing actives all the time. There's arguably a lot of actives that we're still allowed to use that morally we shouldn't be, insecticides in particular, and whether we should be learning a lot more things from the insecticide side of things from organic. So there's certainly a lot of things we're going to be taking back and trying to incorporate into the strategic farm and what we're looking at going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, John, right, just quick fire these, we've got a few.
Okay.
Do you graze any of the crops to aid management of canopy or structures?
We have done grazing before with our sheep, and I think it's mainly a sort of opportunistic thing. We did a blackgrass trial and we managed to reduce blackgrass heads by 20%, but then you still got 80% still there. But going back to the sort of, you've got to be doing everything. It's just one tool. It's not the answer to everything. But if you've got your blackgrass under control by using all those other things, 20% is quite a handy percentage. So now we have sheep on the farm. Yeah, we're starting to look at using them for grazing crops as well.
Do you use elemental sulfur as a fungicide at all?
No, I don't, but I probably should be looking more at what I can do to increase yields. But back to that input thing, I sort of hope nothing's going to work, but if it does work, I'm going to be all over it like a rash.
If more people go organic, will the premium remain so high, do you think?
Yes, of course it will. No, I think that's a very interesting question. I think it's a very interesting question. If more people go organic, it means that if the market continues to grow, it'll demand for more people to go organic. And I think we'll just be looking at a different economic model. So don't worry about that. Just get on with it, and maybe we can market stuff together and get even better price premium.
Do you have open days for conventional farmers thinking of converting so you can push them over the edge?
Yes, I do. There's nothing more boring than talking to a load of organic farmers who are all agreeing with each other. It's much better to be talking amongst conventional, no-till, low-till, all different kinds of farmers. We've all got, we are. The great thing about the diverse nature of farming in this country is that there's so much knowledge, and whether anybody else likes it or not, we do have the answers. We've just got to keep talking, knowledge exchange all the way.
Thank you for the impressive figures. Taking a step back from crop nutrition, would you be allowed to use manure from a non-organic unit?
Yes, you can if it's from an extensive system, and I don't know the exact requirements, but we have done in the past. The only thing that's killed it for us is because the free range system is now, as in chickens and whatever it is, pigs or whatever, because they've now got they're allowed to use GM protein, we're not allowed to use it.
Even though your crops are sold in the UK, do you feel a threat from imports?
No.
How should politicians view organic farming?
Sorry, wait a minute. Threat, yes, I do. Actually, sorry, threat from imports of organic grains. Yes, absolutely. And the reason why we need more people to convert is most buyers, because there's not enough supply in the UK, are focusing on people from outside the UK. So yeah, I do feel a threat, but we've got to do something about it.
Okay, I'm going to ask it. How should politicians view organic farming with regard to feeding the world in 2050 with a potential population of 9 billion people, in your opinion?
Feeding the world has got nothing to do with what we're yielding in this country. It's got a lot to do with much more complex reasons, politics, grain storage, so on and so forth. It's just a complete red herring. And do you know what? Also, the other thing I was on a personal note, you know, I'm not farming to feed the world. I'm farming to make a profit and feed my family.
Good answer. What was the slug pressure like before conversion and now after?
What was the what?
The slug pressure.
Well, we grew oilseed rape, so there was the slug pressure. There's no slug pressure we've found farming organically. The only time we have had slugs is after a really, really lush fertility lay. We can use ferric phosphate.
Have you done any field scale releases of predators to deal with insect pests such as ladybirds?
No, because my feeling is that if you've got that balance right, the last thing you want to be doing is introducing anything. It's about building up natural populations.
Do you import compost? No, move on.
I have done in the past, but there's too much plastic in it, and I just don't like seeing bits of plastic around the farm.
If somebody was thinking of going organic, is it better to aim for high or low soil nutrient status before the conversion period starts?
It depends what you apply. I mean, if it's slow released, then put on as much as you like, but obviously within the bounds of NVZ rules, of course. I think if you you don't need to do anything like that as long as you're going into a proper organic system, a proper organic rotation.
With the definitions of organic varying between countries, are you concerned that the organic market is being flooded by cheap products produced to lower standards?
Yes, I am. I think that we do need to make absolutely sure that the products that are being and grains that are being imported are produced at the same standards. And to my knowledge, people like Waitrose are encouraging their buyers to walk the food chain, which means they have to go back to the source and find out that it is actually certified properly.
It's really interesting. We were speaking about that earlier on after a visit to an unnamed European country, shall I say,
Yeah.
where their organic certification is almost a halfway house between our conventional and organic over here. So although it's marketed as organic, they're allowed to use certain products that wouldn't be allowed over here. So yeah, it's a really interesting one on different standards through nearby European countries.
And the other thing I would add about other European countries is that we, as organic farmers, have paid the lowest amount of environmental scheme amount than any other European country. I think maybe there's a couple lower than us, but certainly in Sweden they get double the amount of money for being organic. So, you know, some governments recognise the public goods organic farming offers more than others.
Is your blackgrass situation reducing or under control?
I would say under control and reducing.
Again, this is something that we spoke about earlier on, and I found really interesting that as a conventional farmer where I'm spraying for blackgrass and other weeds as well, and I'm spending a hell of a lot of money on blackgrass control on my farm, to come here and for John to say actually it's sort of it's at a certain level in the crops, but it's not getting worse. In fact, it's getting from where he was on a few of his blocks a few years ago, it's actually a hell of a lot better than it was back then.
How does being organic affect your countryside stewardship scheme?
How does it affect it? It is part of the organic is part of the countryside stewardship scheme.
Sorry, I asked that. If we are in a countryside stewardship
that word.
Is this impacted when converting to organic?
I think you have to come to the end of your scheme, or you have to stop the scheme you're in and then convert to organic. But I'm not the right person to ask about that. But that's what I believe is the case.
God, we're really jumping around topics here. Any problems with docks in grassland and how to control them?
Yes. And I have no idea. I mean, I just think docks hate competition. And the way we've got rid of docks and creeping thistle is to grow a really, really thick stand of diverse clover lay.
How do you mentally deal with the losing battle from a pest, weed or disease?
I don't lose any sleep over it at all, because I feel it's all under control, and we've got our system right. So no, I just don't worry about it. I think it's perception. And actually, when we were out in the field today, I said to Rob, and I could see Rob was going, "Oh my God, this does look a little bit different." And the thing is, I've been looking at it for so long; it's just completely normal to me. Yeah, no, don't worry about it at all.
Do you have any field beetle banks or strips to encourage more natural predators within the field?
No, I hate them, because they actually attract thistle down. They attract thistle down, and then you've got thistles across your field. Look, you know, we're not spraying any herbicides at all. We don't need beetle banks. We've got weeds sitting in the bottom of our crops, and so our whole field is a beetle bank.
But actually, someone's actually did a suggestion about your docks. Apparently treated with molasses and then grazed with cattle works.
Oh, really? That's very interesting. So now I've got to buy some cattle.
Yeah. Have you looked at agroforestry systems, and do you see yourself ever using them?
Yes, I'm just such a coward. I used to go and see Martin Wolf, who sadly passed away recently, at his farm in Fressingfield called Wakelands. And he was an amazing man. He's going to be sadly missed. And I really, the only thing I regret is I didn't do any before he died. The plan is on 3 fields near to Chimping Park Farm is to do 3 fields starting next year when they go into fertility day.
We're going to get to okay, these are the last 2 questions, all right? Are you worried about the incessant media anti-meat / livestock agendas given organic systems work best with animals? No,
I'm not worried about it. I'm not worried about vegans or whoever. I mean, the fact is we've got to feed vegans, so we need to understand, you know, how we tap into that, you know, increasingly popular way of eating. I mean, the thing that worries me are the activists who are who make farmers' lives a misery, and we shouldn't confuse the activists with vegans.
Okay, final question for the evening. Is your choice to be an organic farmer a financial or moral one?
It was purely financial at the beginning, and now I've gone a bit native.
Right, okay, just because it's Richard Kane, one more question that he missed. This from Northern Ireland, so I can understand it. Can organic arable work in high rainfall areas, i.e. 50 inches plus?
I have no idea. I think it probably can work anywhere, and there's certainly organic farmers in Southern Ireland who are making it work. Ben Colchester, to name a few. I mean, and there's some great organic growers in Southern Ireland. So I don't see why you can't. It just might be a bit challenging, but the solutions are just going to be different, but there will be solutions.
Excellent. I think we'll call it a day there. And thank you for that. I've never seen a speaker eat up all the questions. So well done.
I love the questions. I love the questions. Yeah.
That's usually the sticking point. And we're just about the time. Right. All that leaves me to do is thank our speakers tonight, John and Rob. Thank you very much for all the time and effort that's gone into providing tonight. Really thoughtful, insightful, fascinating webinar. Been really enjoyable to do. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
And I hope you enjoyed the process. As always, if any of you have any feedback or ideas of what you'd like to see at webinars going forward, you receive the invites from me. It's got my details on. I actually love having a bit of input on what you'd like to get out of it. Please don't be afraid to contact me and let me know. Finally, shameless plug from me and Rob, on 5th of June is the open day at his Leamington Spa at the Strategic Farm, Leamington Spa Football Club at 1 o'clock, 5th of June. We've got an all-star cast of John sat with us, John Pawsey today, Jonathan Blake, Christina Clark from ADAS, Anne Bogle from ADAS. They'll be looking at soil health and crop rooting, and then Richard Pywell from the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. It's our big annual event, and if you live in driving distance, I advise coming over. Anyway, that's all from us. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Good night.